Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the manager of public programs. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's lecture by Julia Robinson, The 1960s, the Crucible of the Postmodern. This event is presented as part of the citywide festival, The 1960s, The Years That Changed America, organized by Carnegie Hall. Programming for the festival runs through March 24th, and I would like to thank our partners at Carnegie Hall, particularly Adrian Fuchs, for their support and encourage you to visit carnegiehall.org/1960s or take a program by the door for full details on everything else coming up. And as we were planning for tonight's event with them, we sort of searched for connections to our institutional history. So our speaker might connect to some of those moments in the Jewish Museum's past in the presentation this evening. But I also wanted to mention our new installation on the third floor, Scenes from the Collection, which recently opened and contains nearly 600 works from antiquities to contemporary art. So you can find connections yourselves if you come back and visit the third floor. For information about all of our upcoming programs, lectures, performances, and gallery talks, please visit our website or sign up for our e-news. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Julia Robinson is Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Department of Art History at NYU. Her scholarship focused on experimental artistic practices of the 1960s and has been published in journals such as Performance Research, October, Grey Room, Art Forum, and Moose. Robinson is the editor of the John Cage volume in the October Files series and has a forthcoming book under the same imprint on the Fluxus artist George Brecht. She is also an active curator with exhibitions including George Brecht Events, Heterospective at the Museum Ludwig, The Anarchy of Silence, John Cage and Experimental Art at MACBA in Barcelona, and New Realism's 1957 to 1963, Object Strategies Between Ready-Made and Spectacle, and Plus or Minus 1961, Founding the Expanded Arts at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Now please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Julia Robinson.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you, Haley and Jenna, for organising the program, everyone else who did. So when we think about the decade of the 1960s, whether it be in art or in the world at large, a number of exuberant, iconic images come to mind almost immediately. I just can't see the light. I haven't got light on my... Sorry, it's hard to read. We think of a moment when post-war recovery was in place, of a burgeoning culture of commodities infused with televisual and filmic imagery that projected it larger than life, creating a kaleidoscopically shifting mediascape of the everyday. We know that artists reacted by adapting, translating, or abandoning more conventional forms of modernist painting and sculpture, and took up technology theoretically and actually. At their best, even in the best cases, they tried to figure the implications of such technologies. As such, the 60s generation is the first, arguably, to demonstrate criteria in art that are still urgent today. They could be called the first postmodernists, if indeed we can apply that term. It's sort of postmodernism starts to sound a little dated almost now, but it has the virtue of naming an end to modernism. Paradoxically, probably the reason that the frame does sound dated is because the change it describes, as addressed particularly in artistic innovations, has only become more relevant. So we have to kind of exceed that idea. However, when Frederick Jameson developed this theory in the 1980s, interestingly enough, he named 3 great modern artists as somehow postmodernists avant la lettre. and they were Marcel Duchamp, Gertrude Stein, and John Cage. So we'll get to that shortly, but for now I'd just like you to think about the art tendencies that come most readily to mind as emblematic of the 60s. Most people probably think of pop art, though if you know the illustrious exhibition history of this museum, you might also say minimalism, recalling the landmark Primary Structures show here in 1966. Depending on your knowledge of the decade, you could also think of Fluxus, conceptual art, or even institutional critique. What I want to do tonight is to have you let go of those ideas and suspend your disbelief, to see how productive we can be, we can see things without the help of neat canonical categorizations. We want to try to ask questions that change our view of the art and to bring out more of what was going on in the minds of those who were making it. For instance, pop art supposedly drew in the real, as so much vocabulary heretofore unknown in art. But we could probably say that minimalism was more actual in many ways, that breaking into the space of the viewer, it dealt with an even more palpable real than pop. To do this contrast justice, we'll need to be sure to have the fullest definitions of both on the table. In turn, this is my aim this evening, we'll want to consider the questions that the art and the artists themselves asked, the research they undertook, not merely the results as we now have them. This is where the idea of the experimental comes in. In what follows, I hope to take your sense of that concept, experimental, from the general to the specific, and in doing so, offer you a new lens onto this extraordinary decade, the 60s. So, in pop art, just to kind of have a devil's advocate thing for a moment, essentially American culture as the referent and the most prevalent subject matter seems to have collaterally branded that movement. For instance, the name Richard Hamilton comes up much less often, say, than Andy Warhol. But the difference of their approaches proves immensely instructive. Hamilton himself offered a now classic definition of pop. Pop art is popular, he said, designated for a mass audience, transient, short-term solution, expendable, easily forgotten, low cost, mass-produced, young, aimed at youth, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, and big business. But this position on Hamilton's part was arrived at analytically. So it was part of the larger project, and this is sort of an idea of getting back to research. Some of you know the independent group that ran through the 1950s and met at London's ICA, Institute of Contemporary Art, involving a group of people thinking through and across disciplines, including science, art, technology, product design, and popular culture. And in this context, they tried to sort of think of all this in the context of what they saw around them as a rapidly changing world. So we might think of it more as a think tank. Figures like Edoardo Paolozzi, Richard Hamilton, and John McHale were sort of the artists involved, and then they were joined by the critic Lawrence Alloway, who in fact coined the term pop art. But Hamilton spoke of this activity. I'm just sorry to identify the slide. So Paolozzi brings he creates collages already in the late 40s that he uses magazine images that he's been given by American military that he meets and sort of puts them together, well in advance of what we think of as the key images of pop. But, so already in 47 you have the two works on the left. The independent group are organising exhibitions where they're putting images of different scales all through the space, thinking about photography differently, thinking about models for future research, their own artistic research that they can put into space as a kind of working exhibition model. And on the lower right is Hamilton's infamous founding of pop collage. Just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing, from 1956. Now, for those of you who haven't sort of looked closely at this work, it's kind of extraordinary, all the layers that he builds into it. From the moon figure at the top, which is sort of envisaging the space race, to the kind of phallic dimension of commodities, from the vacuum cleaner that extends all the way up the stairs to the popsicle, candy pop in the weightlifter's hand, to this kind of these cut-out figures that are more magazine images than real-life people. And you notice the magnetic tape recorder and player at the bottom of the middle of the screen. So this sort of thought about technology, film images from a cinema scene in the background. So it's very analytical, the way how Hamilton was bringing it together, and his colleagues. And that's what really differentiates it from American pop. Because the Americans were surrounded by it was their culture, somehow it's sort of interesting to see the analytical distance that happened in England. And what I'm going to try and develop as we go through this lecture is somehow a laboratory concept between all of the artists, whether you're a dancer, a composer, a painter, or a poet, through this early moment of the 60s. So this laboratory concept, we might say, starts with the independent group. So Hamilton said that he felt the need to cope with technology to sort of think through what the next phase it would be in art. He said, a great artist has a vision and finds the technical means to create it. If the means don't exist, he'll invent them, as a chemist or an engineer might. But the vision comes first, not the technological background. So it's really the thinking first that comes in English pop. So this pop can't fail to make us think differently then about the entire landscape of the turn of the 60s. So in the same period as the independent group, we see the activities of another collective, the Gutai group in Japan, who were challenging traditional art practices there and sort of working those through by deconstructing radically modernist painting, ideas of modernist painting. So their extraordinary innovations in performance then lead to other collectives in Japan, such as High Red Centre, just to name one. So this assault that they construct on painting, on the top left you see Murakami breaking through a planar structure of paper. So once engaging, say, the idea of the shoji screen in Japanese culture and the plane of modernist painting. So this assault on painting and sculptural conventions becomes a basis for a kind of breaking of codes that then draws in people from music. There are composers that are involved in the several early Japanese collectives. And then finally, all kinds of, who are all different disciplines are kind of brought into how performance might create a new field of artistic practice. So, and with that, the Japanese groups, they're sending out their Gutai magazine, their various publications, conscious of a need to be networked, to be connected to other artists in the world, and they end up kind of sort of connecting with what was going on in New York, with Fluxus activities. So things are not as separate as we might imagine. So then, how then, if we're thinking of composition, music, performance, visual art, how do we consider this moment when composers set out to illuminate their musical innovations by unprecedented extra-disciplinary experiments in realization? When poets use scores to shift the basis of their work along the lines of chance and duration? When dance becomes a contingent mode of construction, governed by text-based rules? When an ontology of sculpture could be reversed, even eradicated on the basis of the corporeal address of a prop? Indeed, when a thoroughgoing concept of spatio-temporal extension could exact from artistic disciplines a simultaneous disintegration of their boundaries. This is the expansive field that we see around so-called minimalism. So if art history first focused on sculpture as the salient mode beyond painting of the, perhaps indeed because of the forceful statements like those in primary structures, we might today then want to think of a different kind of primary structure and sort of zoom in on a more laboratory model of how that was developed. So Pollock, if we're sort of drawing these lines between the modern, the postmodern and the contemporary, Pollock might be seen as the figure of modernism who signals its apotheosis and its end. He not only shook up the interpretation of painting for his own generation, but he troubled that project of abstraction that was the culmination of modernism. So the question for the next generation of artists was, where do you go from here? Abstraction had to become transferable, thinkable as a process, not a fixed object like a painting. So Pollock is this extraordinary example. Also, the photographs of him start to look like, to artists, like performances. Small anecdote that's kind of useful is that Alan Capro sees a Pollock show at Betty Parsons' gallery, and the gallery's so small and the paintings are so big, and they're on all the walls that they almost seem to kind of envelop him, that he starts to think of Pollock's so-called all-over painting as something like an environment. So this sort of excess of painting, the beyond painting, starts to be a kind of set of ideas that have to be developed. So in this, beg your pardon, sorry. So one important thing that happens in the Pollock criticism is that his work starts to be read as chance, rather than, say, surrealist automatism. Okay, so abstract expressionism is discussed in terms of automatism, that critics connect it to surrealism, and suddenly in 1950, one critic who had been associated with a surrealist magazine, View, Parker Tyler, calls Pollock's work, he says he's marshalling the forces of chance, right? So suddenly, and he clears this slate of former associations, even his own language of surrealism, deciding that and deeming the drip painting something experimental, he says, as a problem for others to solve. That's what Pollock leaves. So following from that idea of the experiment, Rosalind Krauss has focused us on this idea. She's highlighted the way that viewing the Pollockian skeins as akin to traceable evidence. A scientist sets up an experiment and follows a protocol. They might be able to conduct it over and over again. So this is sort of the experimental position we're put in looking at a Pollock. But, Krauss says, the mystery in Pollock, the mystery that confronts us, arises from what cannot be repeated. So this is a very difficult position if you're an artist, trying to kind of pick up on Pollock or continue an artistic project. And I think the most compelling aspect of that is to see abstraction as something that the mind does in the world rather than as this kind of final and impossible to beat model of painting. So the way that many younger artists got around this impasse of Pollock was through the presence of Duchamp, who was more and more visible in the decade of the 50s and early 60s. So Duchamp, initially he was sort of touted as the father of the ready-made, but that really doesn't get us very far, and it's ultimately not it doesn't do justice to how Duchamp was read at the time. So more complex questions asked even by the artists of the time, since there were no ready-mades still in existence, the original ready-mades, were things like, what is the relationship between the ready-made and the photograph? Did Duchamp add something more to that object by its photographic condition? The other extraordinary thing is that with this Pollockian chance, there seemed to be a way in which Pollock had seized on the indeterminate, the impossible to represent, grabbed a piece of that indeterminacy and put it into painting. But with this idea of it being unrepeatable, then other models had to be sought. And so in the 40s and onwards, Duchamp started to be known as someone who'd given up painting at least 20 years ago. And it was sort of like shocking. Here's this artist and he can be an artist without painting. How is that possible? So artist and painter were almost synonymous through the 50s, in the minds particularly of many critics. So Duchamp was the one figure that had addressed this very interesting, complicated field of chance. So chance had become a measure in the 20th century. In the 19th century, chance was almost something to be avoided, right? It was the product of not knowing enough that these chance events would occur. And once you get from Planck to Einstein in the 20th century, chance becomes a measure and part of the way that we construct the universe. So artists were saying, well, Pollock isn't really transferable in that way, but Duchamp had already, in that very moment of Einstein, given himself a kind of experiment. He had defined this concept of the experiment, art as an experiment, by setting himself a protocol, right? So the work on the upper right, 3 standard stoppages, is essentially the product of Duchamp inviting chance to participate in, to be that measure that it had become, right? So he, famously said, "I'm not the author of this work, the author's chance." Of course, it was an extraordinary way of framing chance. So Duchamp's stoppages get installed in MoMA in the 50s in the Catherine Dreier collection, along with other of his work, including this small glass. Now, more recently, and because of the work that followed, we've started to be able to think of this small glass as a kind of even more extraordinary object than we, heretofore imagined. So what you can't see in this slide is a panel going across the glass, which says, which is its title, its longer title, "To be looked at with one eye, close to from the other side of the glass for almost an hour." All right, so unbelievable that it's not only Duchamp's works are of course a critique of painting on glass brought in the world in another way, the Renaissance idea of painting as a window, but this work actually told you where to stand, how to look, and if you could read the instruction, you were on the wrong side of the glass, so you had to go around the other side, for how long to do it, and all of these things. So one may radically think of it as the first instructional work of the 20th century, embedded in it being this critique of painting. So with all these propositions. Duchamp also, as it was announced, had defined his work as an experiment, meaning you can't use your whole toolbox of analysis for painting, analysis for, classic analyses of art in order to read this art. He dismissed standard categories by saying, my work is an experiment. So much as Cage has been credited with the idea of the experimental, it does emanate from Duchamp. And Cage actually took a long time to admit the connections with Duchamp. Even in the 70s, he said, well, we were very close, but we didn't really ever talk about work, right? Because this was such an extraordinary thing that he was reformulating that he might have wanted all the credit to himself. Cage gives, this is where we get to this idea of making the experimental, shifting it from the general to the specific. So Cage wrote several texts defining the experimental between 55 and 57. And for him it was tied to his concept of indeterminacy, but he only develops that fully in 1958. And he develops quite a bias, like a very eccentric model of indeterminacy, if you like. So just to think about what he does with the definition of indeterminacy in 55. So he says, formerly, whenever anyone said that music I presented was experimental, I objected. It seemed to me that composers knew what they were doing, and that the experiments had taken place prior to the finished works, just as sketches are made before paintings, and rehearsals precede performances. Now, on the other hand, times have changed. Music has changed, and I no longer object to the word experimental. I use it, in fact, to describe the music that especially interests me and to which I am devoted. There's a bit of a glitch in the slide, sorry about that. So whether somebody else wrote it or I wrote it myself, what has happened is I've become a listener. So we know the much more renowned argument of Roland Barthes, the death of the author and the birth of the reader. So this is quite a decade before that concept was formulated, and whether we can debate whether Cage did completely become a listener. Some of his students had doubts about that, but anyway, this is how he formulated the experimental. And then beautifully he was asked to sort of rethink it in a lecture in Europe, and he said, actually, America has an intellectual climate, like he was sort of saying it's easier to invent in America, suitable for radical experimentation. We are, as Gertrude Stein said, the oldest country of the 20th century. So Cage's book Silence gets published in 1961, and with that, the Duchamp reception that is growing meets Cage's ideas as well. Interestingly enough, his most famous piece, 433, is barely mentioned in that book, Silence. But it's important to sort of, as a matrix for us to think about what goes on amid artists after this. So he actually, at the time, connected 433 with the painting of Rauschenberg, which is sort of interesting to think as a strategic move on Cage's side, because music wasn't actually getting the same kind of attention as art was getting. So he and Rauschenberg was becoming very well known by the early 60s. So in that year, he's sitting on a panel with Duchamp at the Art of Assemblage show at MoMA. So it was kind of good timing for Cage to connect 433 with Rauschenberg. But in the 50s, when he developed it, he first wrote it on plain old staff notation. That score got lost conveniently because it was a fairly conservative way to write the most radical musical piece to date in the 20th century. So he let that go, and then he recast it in what he called proportional notation or space-time notation. So that's the one in the middle, where 1/8 of an inch equals 1 second. And this he compared to the abutments of Rauschenberg's white paintings. And then the third version, interestingly, comes a bit later, after he's connected with younger artists in the end of the 50s as he's teaching. So then he recasts it as text, and that too will have crucial implications. What's amazing about 433, people don't analyse it very carefully very often, but it's an extraordinary confluence of chance and indeterminacy. And it helps us define the difference between those two terms. Cage criticised himself for only using chance in the phase of composition. So he spent 8 months composing a piece where he would toss coins and consult the I Ching and finalise this composition known as music of changes. But once he'd done that, it was finished, right? And so every performance would be using this same structure. What indeterminacy does is make every time that it's realised different by composing parts of a score that then the performer has to put together. What some of his students felt was that he didn't think of the audience still. He thought of the composer and the performer, but maybe not whether the audience could understand what was going on. But in any case, he only really defines that idea of putting the score together on the spot in 58, when he creates this term indeterminacy. So 433 has all that in it. It's different every time, no matter where. It's sort of site-specific, if you like. It involves all the environment, wherever it is, into the future. And so it sort of did this in 52, way before Cage had even theorised that idea. But when he does, in the late 50s, Duchamp is speaking about a particularly difficult piece of news for younger artists to hear, that, whatever they put into the artwork, it's not going to be necessarily interpretable by the audience. So Duchamp gives a lecture called The Creative Act in 1957, where he essentially speaks about the fact that whatever the artist does, all the passions, this is 1 year after Pollock's died, all the kind of passions and emotions and direct expression that you might put into an artwork is not going to be legible in the result to others. So Cage had moved out of that idea of direct expression, and he had started to write scores that were indeterminate, like this one, Fontana Mix, which will then be used by Yvonne Rainer and people in dance and people in visual art to kind of make all kinds of work. So this sort of intersection of Duchamp's news about, guess what, what you put into the artwork is not necessarily going to be received, so you have to understand that you're collaborating with a spectator. And then Cage's proposition for a score that he didn't know what it was going to look like or sound like when it was performed. These came together in 57, 58. And this is what creates what I'm talking about as the kind of laboratory of the next generation. So Cage, how these ideas get transmitted is that Cage is teaching a class at the New School. He does that, interestingly, in terms of the where do we go after Pollock history. He starts in 1956, the year Pollock dies, and teaches it through 1960. And so he finds himself confronted not only by would-be composers, but many people who don't ever want to write composition or be musicians at all. In fact, they're artists looking to Cage's methods to try and think where they can take art. And artists did realise that the place beyond painting had to do with the spatio-temporal field that music could grasp far better than anything else, right? So it was what one of the artists called a relativistic field. Wherever you were hearing the music, it just encompassed a field that no painting could possibly account for in its conception. So this is why artists and poets and all kinds of people who will be integral in the downtown, what I'm calling this laboratory, they start with Cage's model and expand it. So the class was, when Cage started teaching it, it was called composition, and it had mainly music people there. By 58, when he's starting to get all these artists, he calls it, first he goes to experimental music, and then he takes out the word music altogether and calls it experimental composition. And he says that it's available to people with or without previous training, and he emphasises just as long as you're inventive, right? And the story goes that he was quite amused when artists said, I know nothing about music, and they sat there and sort of promised him that they didn't have one bit of experience, and so he started to smile and kind of enjoyed that. So it was really a place that used composition as a matrix of invention without insisting on a discipline. The first results of that are Alan Capro in 1958 conceived of a total art. So Cage had talked about total sound space, and that now this field of sound can be minutely measured by new technologies. So Capro then extends that out to speak about a total perceptual field for art. And he's at the time collaborating with a couple of other artists, and as soon as they've done with the first Cage class that they take in 58, they write this text called A Project in Multiple Dimensions. Now, some people think that this kind of moment of thinking is pure Cage. In fact, in the class, there are people who are working in electronic composition, and what the electronic composers find out, which Cage absolutely positions himself against, is that there are thresholds of perceptibility, right? So if you play something at a certain volume, it will be heard, it has to be louder to be heard in the same way, right? All this, they were using a lot of recording technologies, working things out in the studio, so they had all these kind of very detailed graphs of people's perception in real space and time. So the artist put together this idea about using light, space, sound, all of these details already in 58. And the discussion amongst electronic composers was there's all this potential to seize on a perceptual field, but the technology's too expensive and it's almost impossible now. So these, George Brecht, Alan Capro and Robert Watts wrote this text, A Project in Multiple Dimensions, as a grant proposal to try and get the money to execute these ideas. It doesn't happen. So what Capro does is develop an exhibition where he coins the term happenings, but why I'm drawing attention to it now, I think, is to kind of get away from, those generalisations, get away from the whole idea that happenings is a big art movement, right? This is a project that Capro developed immediately out of the Cage class. Cage came back from presenting Indeterminacy in Europe, and he had just created this piece that many people know because it's now on YouTube and everything, called Water Walk. And this score was a realisation of Fontana Mix, the score I just showed you. So Cage walked around the stage, and no one had really seen a composer walking before and scoring in the idea of walking, right? And he had this sense of a micro-macro structure, so a few things in space and time would match the entire duration of the piece, right? So Capro maps that on to the Rubin Gallery space, this art space, and he creates, what I love about the picture on the top left is that it looks like a stretch of bars for a painting, right? And it's absolutely the transgression of painting. So he divides the Rubin Gallery up into 3 rooms, because Cage had these kind of ratios of structure, 3, 6, 18. So 3 rooms. the audience will go into each of the 3 spaces and they'll see 6 things happen, and then they'll move 3 times, right? So 3, 6, 18. So it's a purely Cagean ratio, and he's now bringing in proto-pop elements and all the senses. So Cage had said, theatre, he redefined theatre in the context of experimental music and said it's an activity that involves all the senses. So Capro took him rather literally and had a woman squeezing orange juice so you could smell orange juice, tape machines playing in the background, and even Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg acted as painters, like in quotations. So the 18 Happenings was completely structured as a kind of imprint of the Cagean model. And interestingly, the rest of Happenings from Oldenburg to Whitman and others have nothing to do with Cage, and that those artists didn't care about Cage. So it's good to kind of try and think about this laboratory idea, this idea of artists talking, coming out of the Cage class, those who rejected it, and see what was at stake in each case. The artist who was sitting next to Capro for 2 years in the Cage class was George Brecht, and he was much more influenced also by Duchamp, and so he developed this idea of scoring everyday objects, stopping painting, resisting the need to paint, and so he had a show right after Capro's show 18 Happenings in 6 parts, which was actually a series of evening performances, and did an exhibition where he equally paced out the space to find the space that people would enter and encounter certain objects, right? So one of them was this medicine cabinet, and he relied on your knowledge of a medicine cabinet to sort of open it and think about what you could do with the items inside. But it was almost a Platonic definition with ready-made attached to it. So one of the things, say, that he was defining, if we think about abstraction recast, as a process, was something like roundness. A circle, a Platonic circle, something just abstractly defined, now is a clock, it's a cup, it's a yo-yo, it's a jar with seeds in it. It's the jar on the lower shelf with cranberry juice that you could drink. So you're grasping that abstraction called circularity, right, with ready-mades attached to the object. So this exhibition was announced with this little flyer on a lunch bag, a brown paper lunch bag, and it gave instructions on how to deal with all the objects in the show. So, for instance, there was a case, and it says, the case is found on a table, it is approached by 1 to several people and opened. And the event lasts probably 10 to 30 minutes. The items inside are used in a way that's, corresponds to their nature. So don't hit your head with a yo-yo, do something yo-yo-like. And then the event will end, it sort of fills the gap between approach and abandonment of the case. So he asked them to repack the case after. So this is really fleshing out that abstraction called time, an event, by people's engagement. In the Cage class, he wrote a score that was more like to do with music, a piece called Timetable Music. So they went to the class, Cage class went to Grand Central Station, took a actual ready-made, the timetable, and worked out, timed an event where they all sat around and observed what was going on in Grand Central in that given period, right? And so that's when he was thinking of music. 2 years later, with the whole scene of the New York avant-garde, including performing in Judson dance things and other events, or things that are made by dancers or composers, not just artists, he then reformulates that Cage music idea as an event. And so he develops this form called the event. So in 61, this sort of artists working together, thinking of the next form, are invited by a gallery, which is normally a kind of painting gallery, Martha Jackson Gallery, to this exhibition that ends up being called Environments, Situations, Spaces. And Capro formulates his idea of an environment based on a kind of three-dimensional Pollock. and picking up on the action in a Pollock painting as an entire experience now for the visitor to the exhibition. Brecht does a piece called Three Chair Events that we could think of as anticipating perhaps elements of institutional critique. He places one chair, a white chair in the gallery with a stack of scores. The other two, the score says 3 chair events, a black one, a yellow one and a white one. But you only have one score in the gallery, this white score. So you have to think about yourself how to complete that act, right? This sort of post-Duchamp, how do I complete this score? He put the black chair in the bathroom, and the yellow chair, which you can't see in the black and white photo, but he put it out the front of the gallery. And actually Klaus Oldenburg's mother sat on it all night, so no one could see that it was part of the piece and the exhibition. So this idea that you kind of, take the basis of something, the only part of the proposition that was understood as art was that in the gallery, right? So artists later will put things outside the museum to make you think, is this art or is this not art? But it's formulated in this early moment. So I can see that time is getting pushing on. So I'm just going to go through quite quickly some of this sort of crucible of the postmodern emanating from the cage background. So in 1961, the artist Yoko Ono makes her loft available to a bunch of different kinds of artists, composers, poets, all wanting to do, they call it concerts, and that allows you to put anything in that frame of time of a concert. So the composer Lamont Young he's trying to really be more radical than everyone else, has this score, a composition that it's dedicated to Robert Morris, and it just has one line saying, draw a straight line and follow it. He writes that in 1960. For the performance at Yoko Ono's loft in 61, he rewrites it 27 times through the whole year, even after the moment of the concert. So there's this strange idea but it's exactly the same thing. The proposition, therefore, of this score, this program, is that even if you do exactly the same thing in a different time, it's different. So he was able to repeat that drawing a straight line from January to December and have you understand that the same thing is different. So all of these kind of one-upmanship ideas about the conceptual basis of an action in time were being developed. Simone Forti also had a concert in that series, and she developed something. She'd been working on an idea she called dance constructions, and she had a first effort at presenting this at the Rubin Gallery. And the reason I mention that is because it was an artist's gallery, and therefore it somehow gave her permission not to call it dance. Right? So then when she gets to do this concert, she develops this series of work that has this incredible neologism aspect about it. It's not sculpture and it's not dance, it's a dance construction. But it intervenes in sculpture just as much as it sort of completely redefines dance. So she had this event in the series at Chambers Street called 5 Dance Constructions and Some Other Things. And one piece she did, which totally recalibrated this big looming model of Cage and Cunningham, where they separated the music from the dance. So Cunningham would do his own dance and Cage would have his own music, and they had nothing to do with each other. So Forti decides to do this with a very stressfully annoying Lamont Young piece, Friction Sounds. So she plays the tape of Lamont Young and gets wound up on a string, and then the person just lets it go, and there's this beautiful reflexive element of the tape unwinding, playing the sound, and Forti unwinding on the rope. And then it stops, and the tape still has about a third to go. So she's there just listening. So it's this extraordinary instantiation of listening. You see an image of Walter de Maria performing it in the lower left. And then another piece that she did for this series, which is now iconic, it's actually been purchased by MoMA as an artwork, is Huddle. So this gives you this idea of a score basis of an action, of something sculptural. Huddle is a noun and a verb. So it names the structure that she referred to and the action associated with its constant transformation in time. In the Loft series, she had 2 huddles, and so all these other works, she spaced them out in this loft, and it's sort of now become a landmark in post-war art. And so Yvonne Rainer, Steve Paxton, all these people were in her dance constructions, and they took that simple gesture of the everyday, and expanded it as the vocabulary of Judson dance. One figure that's always mentioned in association with 40 is Anna Halprin, who also had these long sort of sessions of improvisation on her dance deck in California, and with whom 40 spent many years. But I think if you think about the Cajun context, 40's learning, they're all in a class learning Cage's chance techniques, and it does more to disturb improvisation than it does to follow it, right? So somehow 40's model is a mix, it's a hybrid of everything that was going on at this time, and it can't be reduced to one source or the other. So then, just speaking of a sort of expanded minimalism, she used sound, and she used objects to prompt action. So in the work platforms on the left, she had 2 people walk out and get under these coffin-shaped boxes, right? And that what they had to do is whistle. So suddenly the boxes are not minimalist objects. The whole space around them, that phenomenological space or that perceptual density that minimalism seems to illuminate, was done through sound. This kind of whistling in these 2 boxes as though they were speaking to each other. And then Slampboard is all about 10 minutes of action where you have to deal with the gravity of that 45-degree angled plane, right? And if you're tired, you rest. If not, you pass the rope to someone else, and you kind of develop this action whose logic is legible to the audience, as some of Cage's scores were really not. Okay, so I'm going to start to get to the end since it's nearly an hour. Sorry. Okay, so within this context, the artist Robert Morris, who was at the time together with Simone Forti, is also developing something that is a concert for this series in Yoko Ono's loft. So he develops a work at the bottom, which originally, now it's called Passageway, but if you look at the flyer to that concert series, it was called An Environment. And that really links it to other things that are going on at that time much more compellingly than this later named Passageway. So Morris created a doorway that was flush with the entrance of Ono's loft, like there's no space in between the doorway and you're walking into this. And you walk through this sort of spiral space that diminishes and diminishes. What people don't realise or don't reference very much these days is that it had this heavy sound in the as you're walking through this passageway as well, a heartbeat. So there's this feeling of kind of the pressure of space coming in on you as you're moving through his concert, his passageway that you could visit several days a week, right? And at the same time, he creates this work that refers to itself by this tape recording inside it, which is a recording of how it was made. So sawing wood, hammering nails, and when you go and experience the object, you hear all of that process. Morris' famous story is that he invited Cage over to show him what he'd done, and Cage told him to go away, and he sat down and listened to this screechy, soaring process of its making for hours. So it becomes an object totally implicated in performance. All right, so Lamont Young essentially puts all this new work, people proposing their ideas, whether it's Forti writing up dance or all of these other artists putting it into words. He gathers textual propositions for artworks in this book called An Anthology. And that they don't have enough money to publish it when he's doing that gathering in 61, so it gets published in 1963. But in the meantime, George Maciunas, who's the designer, takes all this new and exciting work and starts Fluxus in Europe with all those, early New York avant-garde models. So just to go quite quickly, but Fluxus essentially uses the basis of the score, the everyday object, the casting into time, the engagement of the audience as a kind of a dematerialised basis for the work of art. So they, for instance, and this event score idea becomes a basis for a lot of their activities. So this work by Brecht's sort of interesting if you think of the trajectory from Pollock, right? So Pollock's drip paintings suddenly becomes an auditory address, drip music, an all-over experience of sound. So it was often performed with drip water from a high ladder into a vessel with a microphone, so you have this kind of all-over dripping. And as you can see, with each performance, it takes on a slightly different element. So George Maciunas in Dusseldorf decided to do it from a ladder. In the next location, he did it very intimately at the same level, more like what Brecht would have done. So suddenly the score becomes this kind of arena of interpretation, and the artist sort of knew what the other artists, their disposition was, and tried to honour that in the way that they realised it. But the authorship was going around and around. Nam June Paik takes Lamont Young's Draw a Straight Line and Follow It and creates his own work called Zen Forehead, which is another seemingly post-Pollockian gesture that he calls action music. I'm going to go a bit faster through this, but so you just see, actually this Olivetti is quite beautiful. It was made, it's a score by George Maciunas, who's the founder of the group Fluxus, and he uses an Olivetti adding machine that spits out these numbers, right, rows of numbers. And according to what number you get, you have to raise your hat, put up an umbrella, sit down, bow. And I feel like it's almost an image, everyone's in suits. It's like a Duchampian Malik molds forced into this kind of condition of, in post-industrial order in what Adorno called an administered society. So the Olivetti adding machine kind of turning that Duchampian model into something even more controlled in the post-war period. So these are the kind of things that the indeterminate score could play out. So Fluxus comes back to New York and ends up on Canal Street. Just going to go fast. I feel like I'm running out of time. So just to cite two, I guess, canonical works and what they bring out of the audience. Alison Knowles has a piece that is a proposition. Lamont Young calls his work a composition. That still puts the author in a place of some power. If you say proposition, you're proposing something to the audience, not sort of ramming it down their throat. So her piece, the one that you see here, the proposition was make a salad. And she performed it at the ICA in London, exactly with the independent group where they had been working, and sort of made the sound of making a salad and the collective experience of it, which she then shared the salad, the performance. So if you think of things recently like Rikrit Taravanija and other things, they're all emanating from this idea. She also had a piece called Shoes of Your Choice, and just since we started with Hamilton, I have to say he was one of the first performers of that piece at the ICA in London, and he got up and took off his 60s style big platform shoe and started. The idea was that you describe your own shoe and formulate the piece yourself. So he spent half an hour talking about why he had this great pair of shoes and where he got them and why he liked them and everything. So this is an extraordinary handing over of the entire composition to the receiver. In Yoko Ono's Cup piece, one thing to say, there's plenty to say, but I just say that it brought out a sort of psychology of the audience, how violent people wanted to be to respond to this idea. She offered scissors and they could cut off her clothes, as most people know, but it generated something in the personalities of the people who were there. Some people were very violent. Sometimes women were more violent than men. And so it's a kind of like a crowdsourcing of some kind of reaction when you offer a matrix. I mean, whatever we think about the rather alarming work of Marina Abramović, she has built on this entirely, right? So all of these models start to look like bases of things we know better now. I don't know. Well, one thing I'll say about Judson dance is that a lot of the artists were using scores. They were in a class where they learnt Cage's scores, indeterminate scores. And they decided that they weren't very applicable to dance. And this raises a question about indeterminacy in this moment, that in fact, Merce Cunningham said, I don't want to use it because the dancers might run into each other and hurt themselves or something. Like he wasn't interested in indeterminacy, even though he gets like quite a good reputation for kind of being, for him and Cage as these radical figures. So it's a more tricky territory than we might imagine. So Paxton, Rayner, and others all started composing with chance, and then, as Rayner said, then she just developed the look of indeterminacy. And she said a lot of Judson just looks like that. So that sort of takes us very far away from those rigorous chance operations that we started with. So then as the 60s culminates in this kind of idea of, bringing into that indeterminate field, confronted by the artist, possibilities of technology. So on the Dionysian and the Apollonian side of this, you have, on the one hand, Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable, on the other hand, Billy Kluver and Rauschenberg and others, EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. And finally, just to sort of end where we began, I want maybe to throw the idea out that we think we can possibly see even minimalism now in a different way. So I'm just showing you, first of all, this column by Robert Morris, which started as a piece at the Living Theatre, that is, as you know, some of you know very well, that it was a performance. So he had 7 minutes, he showed it vertically for 3.5 minutes and knocked it over and showed it horizontally for 3.5 minutes. All of this to say that even Judson calling itself minimalism didn't exist in 62 to 64. So it's far more interesting to say what generated it, right? So similarly, Walter de Maria creates this column structure and writes a letter to Cage and says, dear Mr. Cage, I thought I should tell you I made a portrait of you. And that, once there becomes sort of money and support by figures like Robert Scull in the mid-60s, that gets turned into steel and becomes the object in primary structures, right? So what are the sources by which the monuments we have of the 60s have been, firmly put in place? Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there and open it up to questions if anyone has any. Thanks a lot.
Is this on? Maybe I'll come around with a microphone if anyone has questions. Please raise your hand. Yeah? Okay. Oh, wow, it definitely is on.
You did a great job of explaining the different movements and that were happening during that period. But could you distill, in a sense, for us, where the postmodern of say the 30s and the 20s, which were a postmodern period in their own way, how did they come? Did they take a break? Did they come back? How did we get here? In sort of a summarized way.
I wouldn't call the 20s and 30s postmodern.
I mean, when you're talking about architecture and you're talking about,
it's pretty modern.
So you're not saying it's postmodern?
Within modern,
So you're saying postmodern is basically beyond the modern? Is that how you're saying?
Yeah. So why we think about Cage in that respect is because suddenly his definition of theatre broke the discipline of music. He said, we have eyes as well as ears, we might as well use them, right? So when you're sitting, hearing a piece of music, all your other perceptions are going on, right? So that's a postmodern model of perception. If modernism is medium specificity, a focus on disciplines, and of taking the logic, say, action to its quintessence, right? So postmodern models break all that.
It breaks it up again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
I find it hard to understand how from the very beginning it ends up with something like Solowit and Donald Judd. I mean, from this very free
it doesn't
form.
exactly end up with him.
Or how it comes to it, how it evolves to it.
I'm glad you pointed that out. No, because you had that opening slide that the museum showed of primary structures, I essentially wanted to bring you back to see if you see that a little differently by now, right? So it's not that it ends with those artists, it's that how can we look at this steel object called cage in the primary structure show the same way if we know about Morris's column and de Maria's sort of pilot project with this little wooden object, right? So the Lewitt and Judd and everyone should look a little different to you at this point. I mean, in fact, Judd was a critic through this entire period, and he saw everything. It troubled him. He famously said that there wasn't enough art going on in Morris's work. In his famous essay, Specific Objects, people forget this, but he connects Morris and George Brecht and says, those two haven't got enough going on. They're dealing with understatement and things like that. So he's for a while, he's a critic. He writes about this exhibition called Black, White and Grey, and he's not the Judd that we know from 65 onwards in these years. He's really working through exactly some of the things that I've been showing. So when you get this crystallization of this exhibition, it isn't the whole story, and hopefully that's what I've been trying to demonstrate.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Was there a last one? No? Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks
Thank you
a
so
lot,
much,
everyone.
Julia.